Hi there. This is Steve, one of the hosts of the Creative Bias podcast, which is, of course, the podcast dedicated to helping people and organizations grow their own creative muscles. Welcome to episode 4. This episode that you're about to listen to is a deep dive into how we can apply creativity to modern marketing. And in order to tackle such a sprawling topic, we brought in two guests. And our conversation with those guests was so robust and so thought provoking that I've decided to chop this episode up into 3 parts so we don't lose any of the insightful, juicy goodness that is contained in this episode. Because we want to make things easier and more approachable for you, because we love you, our listeners. So please enjoy part 1 of this episode. And if you enjoy the conversation and want to hear where it goes next, you can jump right into parts 2 and 3. And don't forget to subscribe to the podcast so you know when we drop new episodes. In the meantime, have a very happy holiday. One of the reasons I'm super excited to have this conversation today is because we're going to talk about something that is oddly near and dear to my heart and like I'm kind of obsessed with, which is what is true about marketing in the year 2025? Like, what can we rely on? What can we believe in? Is there a universal truth? Is there anything that we know about like what marketing is all about in this moment in time? And to put it more specifically, because this is the Creative Bias podcast, what is the best place and the best way to apply creativity to marketing? And since I'm not smart enough to come up with those answers myself, I've invited 2 of my dear friends to the podcast today, and I'll introduce them right now. So the first guest on the Creative Bias podcast today is John Doyle, who is the Chief Strategy Officer at Call McVoy. And then our second guest is shrouded in mystery, I would say. We're going to be referring to this guest by the name Donovan, which is not his real name. But Donovan is a marketer who sort of lives at the intersection of creativity, data, and technology, and like dedicates his time and work to improving outcomes and improving the optimization of marketing activity. Is that a fair way to characterize it, Donovan?
Absolutely. And maybe at some point in this conversation, we'll reveal that I'm actually just an agent, AI agent.
You're yes. Donovan is actually just ChatGPT.
He's actually not real.
Yes. All right. Well, thank you guys for being here today. I really appreciate it. And as always, my co-host and esteemed partner in Creative Bias, Darla Gurley, is with us as well. So I want to start this conversation by, just as I normally do, talking about myself, because I'm a very self-involved person. But I want to talk about the fact that I entered the marketing and advertising field at an incredibly interesting time. It was the year 2000. And I would say that advertising and marketing were about to undergo the most meaningful change that the industry had ever gone through. Because up until the emergence of the internet and the World Wide Web, um, marketing and advertising was a pretty like slow moving industry. And it was really based around stories and characters and narratives and campaigns and ideas that were sort of executed across a pretty finite and pretty understandable series of stages. So I'm talking about TV ads, radio ads, print ads, magazines and newspapers. Sometimes you get a cool billboard or two. And that was really where advertising lived. And then in 2000, when the dot-com boom really sort of took off and everybody started having an AOL account and everybody had a modem, and it was funny to talk about the funny noises that modems made, and dot-com businesses started to explode across the web, marketing got crazy. And it's only like continued to get crazier and crazier and crazier as the years have gone on. And I would say that there have been 2 changes that have happened over marketing starting in 2000 until where we are today. Marketers have been given exponentially expanding choices. So way more choices, way more levers to pull, things to play with, contexts to worry about. And the other thing is way more confusion has come with those choices. So I think while we have more options, we have more data, we have more ways to analyze the data, more tools with which to analyze the data. I don't know that 25 years on that we feel like, oh, you know what? All of that added up to help us. Like we figured it out. We know what works when it comes to marketing. I actually think that as options, choices, tools, data, technology have risen in their abundance, truth has become muddier than ever. And so before we go any further, I just want to see John and Donovan, if you guys have any reaction to that statement. Am I being pessimistic here, or would you roughly agree with that?
Probably gonna pause until we figure out our social pecking order and how we respond on this. Donovan, do you want to go first?
Happy to.
Yeah.
I think you're onto something, Steve, right? So, the way in which brands and interact with consumers and the way that media and advertising is kind of proliferated across the internet and the offline world, IRL, if you will, like it's way more complicated than it's ever been, right? And so there's this like a kind of underlying sentiment, I think, between consumers and brands that there's this infinite choice, and there's this kind of kind of undeniable curiosity and expectation that something else is always going to be coming down the pipe. So I think the idea of being able to clearly understand, consumer behavior and really like dial in with all the data that exists has been as challenging as it was, 25 years ago, right? At least in, when we go back a few decades, you have very simple, communication lines, right? It's like I'm sending an ad, through print medium, or I'm sending it through TV. And I know that everyone's sharing this experience at the same time, typically, right? Whether it's reading the Sunday, Times, or they're watching the Oscars, but everyone's doing a lot of those experiencing those things together at the exact same time. And as this idea of like individual world has started to kind of come to bear, where you have your social media presence and you have kind of your ecosystem of who you listen to and who you see and who you interact with, like, even though it's like this personalization kind of concept at scale, there's so much individualism that has materialized that makes it really hard to like think about the broader themes and behaviors that are really driving impact for businesses and consumers.
Totally. Yeah. But I would add, I think that what you described, and we got into this business at the same time, Steve, and I think it's a really weird thing to live through the advent of two major new mediums or
Totally.
phenomena in terms of the internet and AI and just what
Yep.
that's doing. But I think with the thing that's really changed in the dynamic you described at the start is that we do not have concentrated pools of audiences anymore. Like to what Donovan just said, in terms of like we no longer can concentrate and recognize that there's a shared monoculture. That's gone, right? Look,
Absolutely.
an anecdote to kind of that really gave this sort of a really tangible feeling, for me at least, was this last summer we had some interns at the agency, about 7 women, young women. I don't know, just happened to be there all. It was a female class, and one of the things we asked these young women to do was present to the agency at one of our kind of monthly meetups that we do. Their favorite brands. It was a really open brief. Like, tell us about your favorite brand. What is it that you like about them? How did you come to discover them? Et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And I was sort of dry running them through this, just giving them some, panel questions as we were going through it. And one of the most interesting things, I just saw this happen in real time, and it was just really kind of gave the dynamic we're living in such a tangible sort of face, was that after each of these young women shared their brand in the rehearsal for this meeting, they each spoke to each other and said, "I had never heard of your brand before."
That's
Each of them.
incredible.
None of them had heard of the other one's brand. And what that sort of speaks to is kind of the prism about in culture and how, and to them, you got to imagine they're like, oh, it speaks totally to my values, or the product or the offering is
Right.
just really great, or it's entertaining, or it just had like a really good social, all of those different ways of being really, really intense for them. But the
Hmm.
eye was open. It's like, I had never heard of your brand before. And that just kind of talks to the prismatic kind of culture we're living in right now, where things can feel intensely sort of authentic and almost omnipresent in your world, to what Donovan was saying, like these kind of, nobody's in these shared experiences anymore.
Right.
But then have nobody next door to you understand what's going on. And I think that's
Yeah.
just a really interesting dynamic that makes marketing to folks challenging, but I think it's also opening up some incredibly important dynamics and opportunities creatively that I think brands are just coming around to.
Totally. Donovan brought up the word personalization, and I want to get to personalization because that to me is like a huge like linchpin for where we're going in marketing. But I want to ask a question about the anecdote you just told about the folks at your agency who are naming their favorite brands. Were they naming favorite brands as marketers, or were they naming favorite brands as consumers? Because I always feel like there's a bit of observation bias when you ask a marketer who their favorite brand is, because they're gonna like be like, well, I'm going to tell you a brand that I think is good at marketing or branding.
Mm.
So was there any flavor to that dynamic in that?
Yeah, I'm almost certain, and we didn't ask specifically. I'm almost certain these are brands that resonated on a personal consumer chord. So
Got
by
it.
dint of the fact that these young women were just out of school, actually some of them were still in school. A few of them they were only in their first agency environment. Others had interned
Got it.
elsewhere. I don't think they had that kind of muscle memory you're describing, Steve, of like what's going on in the trades, and like what are the
Right.
popular ideas of the trade, who's killing it from a an Effie's perspective or
Right.
what have you. I think they just really brought to themselves, and the stories they told were very personal. And I think that
Yeah.
in that lies a really big opportunity for brands. And I think it's beyond personalization of the marketing appeal.
Mhm.
I think it's resonance at a commercial offering level. Like, how do
Yeah.
you feel really, really built for and centering on a specific consumer culture or audience or use case or what have you? I think that's where this is really getting interesting. Like, how does the
Mhm.
business itself become a little bit more elastic and dynamic in how it connects with people, in their offering, the way they show up culturally, all of that, I think it transcends mere personalization, in a really, really robust and kind of interesting way. And that gets me exciting as a creative strategist and thinker about what brands are going to need to do to win.
I totally agree with that. And I wonder because there's something when you were talking about um talk people selecting brands that, and I don't want to put words in your mouth, but like sort of validate how they see themselves, or like there's something personal about saying like this brand makes me feel like who I really am, or this brand makes me feel seen or whatever. And I also wonder, and maybe we can get to this a little bit later too, but I wonder if one of the value propositions of personalization for consumers is that I would argue, and feel free to be like, stop, you're wrong. But I would argue that one of the things that the social mediaification of the world has done is it has rewarded performative behavior. And so I feel like people are a little bit, even if it's like low key under the radar self-conscious, or like they are self-conscious about the decisions they make and the favorites they have as to what that says about who they are as a person. And I think that when you can make your brand personally relevant to everybody, anybody based on their interests, who they want to be, how they want to present themselves to the world, that's where as an individual you go, yeah, the brands that I love tell the world something about me, right? There's a performative aspect to that. Do you buy that, or do you think I'm overreading that?
So I think there's an aspect of this performative like behavior that comes through, but I think there it always has to be in balance with like perceived authenticity and like the intentions behind that behavior, right? Because you know I think brands, can oftentimes get that piece of it wrong, right? Like they can focus in too much on trying to communicate a thing that they believe that people want them to be. But then when the people like interact with it, they're like, well, like that actually isn't how I see your product. Like I do like it, I like your brand, and you have to some extent articulated like a facet of who I can be, but those two things don't necessarily tie together in the context of how you talk about your brand in the marketplace. And that feels weird to
Hmm.
me, right? And I think
Hmm.
that oftentimes does happen when brands try too hard to like kind of perform that persona, or that present themselves in such a way that like reflects what they believe is their consumer.
Yeah.
Because sometimes the thing that actually consumers connect to is just something maybe a bit more base, or not as um, you know, overly overwrought, in the
Yep.
way that like a brand kind of constructs the narrative. And so I
Hmm.
think so I do think that that's part of it, but I think when the brand focuses too much on trying to get that right, quote unquote, I think it kind of they run further away from who they are as a brand, and create a risk of being seen as inauthentic.
I
Totally agree.
yeah.
Yeah.
Do you, or maybe John, do you guys have an example of a brand who's maybe done that to their detriment?
I mean, the story. This is going way back. Actually, when we were working together, this was happening. I think what we're talking about is when a brand tries to define itself externally and situationally, and changing that based on who they're trying to appeal to. That feels as authentic as somebody you run into at a party who's into everything that everybody talks about and has no internal kind of point of view, right? And it just like you
Like I
feel a
like
little
that
too
too.
yeah, you feel a little too chameleon. Is there any
Mm,
there? It's like I talked to my teenage son about the difference between being internally validated or externally validated in his peer group. And internally validated, just if we just strip away companies and capitalism and brand and all that, internally validated people are naturally charismatic. It doesn't mean that they can't lens that charisma into your context and sort of share something there. And that's where I think the real magic is. But if they're only defining themselves about what's cool right now, that's a very rudderless ship. But I think to the story that kind of got me thinking when you were talking about Donovan, these people was sort of like trying something on because they think it's got some juice in the marketplace or whatnot. Do you guys remember when when Stride Gum, I hope nobody like. I want to work with you guys in the future. I don't want to. If you're the brand manager of that, I'm sorry. But do you guys remember when they made that guy? I'm sorry, not parachute out of a plane and drop out of the plane in this branded stunt that was Red Bullian to the core. I mean, it
Yes.
was the most Red Bull ad on the planet. And it was Stride Gum. I think it was called like Fall from Heaven. And I remember
Yeah.
watching this with a lump in my throat. A guy jumping out of a plane with no parachute to be caught in
It,
this like
it was a
erector set
net.
of nets.
There was a
Yeah,
yeah, it was
and
a
it was
net.
any punchline is he did great. It was amazing, but it had that quality that you're talking about. Where it's like you know, I think almost every year a Red Bull athlete perishes. Maybe multiple Red Bull athletes perish,
Yep.
and nobody's got a problem with that because that's like kind of the cost of being Red Bull. It's so integral to what they do. But if you pull that back, this is an energy drink at its core. They had to build that. They had to build that authenticity over time. They had to make it through a pattern of repeated behavior and character that earned them the right that if a Red Bull athlete should die in an avalanche or base jumping, people just go, I guess that's the
That's
cost
what
of being Red
happens.
Bull.
Yeah.
That's the cost of Red Bull. But if those suckers at Stride come, if that guy had missed that, it would have been a terrible, 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 pox on that entire. It's just what are you doing? What are you guys?
Well,
It's so like it just talks to the dynamic of like what is authentic and earned, and what is it reflect of the consumer's values and aspirations, and what is a try on that just is kind of looks very opportunistic and situational. And I think with our current marketing dynamic, with so many tools and abilities to pull levers and be dynamic and personal to everybody, having a real core sense of self that is immutable is really, really important. And like you might have lots of ways of bringing that to life and lots of different expressions, but you got to have some core truths that don't deviate, right? And so like I totally related to what you were saying, Donovan.
I I agree with that too. And the other thing I think that's funny about that Stride gum thing is like Stride gum did that in response to Red Bull the year prior dropping Felix Baumgartner out of space. And
100%.
then and breaking the internet and going viral. And so every other marketer in town was like, "Oh man, how do we do what Red Bull did?" And the guys at Stride were like, well, "Let's just do exactly what they would have done." But they did it differently. And it's like, who's Stride Gum? Why are they doing this? I've never even heard of them. Nobody in the world had ever like no one's favorite gum is Stride, right? Like
Mm-mm.
so Red Bull has permission to do that kind of stuff because that's what they do. You know, their whole shtick is we give you wings. Like literally, we give you wings. We'll drop you out of space and you'll survive it. So I think that's very interesting. I also think maybe something in what Donovan and you just said, John, is interesting to me, which is kind of you have to present a body of work as a brand that allows the consumer to see themselves in it without telling them what to feel. And I remember I was reading a movie review of there's a new movie out called Emma McKay or Emma Mackey, something
Mm.
like that. It's this new movie. And I haven't seen it and I won't. But apparently in the opening scene, there's a narrator who comes on talking about the protagonist. And she's like, she's the greatest person in the world. I'm head over heels about this girl. And it's like, it's so ham-handed to be like, you are supposed to like this character. You know what I mean? I feel like people
Yeah.
don't like being told what the meaning is. They like being presented with stimuli, fact, whatever, and then allow them to pull the meaning out of it. Does that make sense? Especially from a creative strategy standpoint.
Yeah, I mean, I'll bust in here and then Donovan can take over. But I think that like I think our business is one of building patterns. I think it's like it's very much like we are just talking at a university. I'm up here in Minnesota, Minneapolis, and we are at an advertising class. I'm like, I really hate the name of this class. I just really hate it. Oh, like it just presumes a certain output, and it obscures the intent of what we are trying to do. We're trying to create awareness. We're trying to create recognition, like all these different things. And when we default to certain outputs as assets or campaigns or all this, it just, I think we're in this time of really big rethink. So let's rethink things. And to your
Mm,
point, I feel like a brand's really successful in this non-monoculture where we're not able to sort of message our values to somebody. We
yeah.
have to demonstrate them through patterns. And those
Mm,
patterns will be what's our product about? What is our, our service? What's our, where are we purchased? How all of these things creates this almost mesh network of meaning, for lack of a
yeah.
better term, almost like a geodesic dome. We talk in terms of brand worlds
Yeah.
at Cole McCoy. Like, how do we create a really distinct worldview, and how are we building that, bringing that to life through a pattern of activities, some of which are marketing messages and advertising and media, some of which are new offerings and products and retail environments. And how do I think the hopeful goal is that that when you create space between, what you're actually doing is conscripting your consumer or just people writ large to fill in the gaps. We can all, in this moment right now, going back to a Red Bull and say, where does Red Bull like to vacation? And we all have the same general notion. What kind of
Yep.
a car would it drive? We all have the same general vibe there. Where,
Yep.
who's at its party, what kind of music is going on, and how does that differ from, say, Ralph Lauren or we have a good, we can fill in. It almost makes consumers or humans uh, willing or unwilling co-authors of fan fiction on behalf of your
Yeah.
brand, and then you've got something that's really, that brand is cooking. When you've
Yep.
established that kind of sort of ability to fill in those dots, then that brand is winning, and
Yep.
that's where we need to go, I think.
Donovan, anything to add on that?
I think John's spot on, and one of the things I feel like it comes up often every few years is like, do brands still matter? And I think what we've talked about so far is like 100% yes. Like even in an age where there's so much, anonymization rather of products and services, like brands still stick out because those like these identifiers and the like story of that fan fiction, as John said, like as it comes to bear, like it creates a world. It creates this like broad picture of like who the person that consumes that thing is, and then how a person that is desires to be a consumer of that thing or aspires to be a consumer of that thing kind of like thinks about their path to connecting with the brand, right? And that's where, you know, in this era of advertising, I think that's where, to your point, Steve, like when brands and companies are building bodies of work, that's actually the most critical thing versus like these disparate kind of moments of virality that don't necessarily tell a story like that's cohesive and continuous,
Hmm.
but like is really much like a temporal moment in time that people will quickly forget about. So I think like building brand in that regard, like is so important and more than ever today because so many people can almost like take the assets that you put out there and create their own story about
Totally.
about what your brand is.
There you go.
Right. I think that's so in tune with the way that I think of brand marketing, and I think so. Since we're talking about brand, let me talk about brand because a lot of where this comes from for me is building a brand is to me a very creative exercise. But as a professional marketer, I also think about like, okay, so the creative exercise, arguably artistic exercise of building a brand, allowing consumers to find meaning in it, building a world that means something to people that has all these different sort of like set pieces that define it is great. But does brand and business, how do they live together? How does brand impact business? And I want to get to that because, like, what I think I have always craved since the first moment I came into marketing, I was like a huge baseball fan as a kid, and I was a big Moneyball guy. And I was like, man, I just want marketing to be like Moneyball, like sabermetric baseball, like where you go, we've got all the data, we know what works, we know the levers to pull, we know on base percentage correlates most strongly to winning, so that's what we do. So what's the marketing version of that? And I think because the first of all, it's a horrible equivalency. Like if you are a stat nerd baseball fan and you think that you could apply that same logic to marketing, you cannot. Like it is so different because in baseball, every game is played on a same field with the same positions, the same ways, and all the data points are controlled and all the data points are coalesced and all the data points come together in one database. And so we can get a line on what truth is. Like at best, marketing is more similar to football, where like the circumstances are different, the sample sizes are different, the variables are too dynamic and whatever. So there's just more noise in the data. But I crave truth. And what makes it hard is it's not like in 2000 when the world came online. We were like, oh, so we used to be offline, now we're online, and now let's figure out what works online. Even in the last 15 years. So, like, okay, I got some data for you guys. In 2000, social media was like a nascent thing. There was barely any. In 2010, there were 970 million social media users worldwide. In 2025, there's 5.4 billion social media users worldwide. Okay. In 2010, there were 150 MarTech companies doing business in advertising marketing. Today, there's 14,000. In 2010, 2 zettabytes of data were produced globally, and in 2024, that number was 120 zettabytes. And for context, 1 zettabyte is 1 billion terabytes of data. So the goalposts keep
That seems like
moving.
a lot. That
It's a
seems like a
lot.
lot.
It's a lot of data. I think we have all this data, all this complexity that keeps getting more vast and more complicated. And what I wonder about is like, we know how to build brands, we know how to build worlds, we know how to build stories around brands. People will then react to that world building and tell us, oh, I really like this brand. It reflects my values. I really want this brand because they do good things for the world. I hate this brand because they do bad things for the world. But then if you like look at people's purchase behavior, what they tell you in a survey can't be true. Like it just can't be. So my question for you, Donovan, is what is the relationship between brand and business? And do we potentially overdo it with brand? Are we like too concerned with building like ecosystems of belief around brand when what we should really be doing is shooting for like mental availability and calling it a day. To hear the rest of this conversation, check out episode 4, part 2.